Good morning. Welcome to the garden on this 4th of July weekend. I hope you all have had a good one so far and are have a wonderful day today. A few years ago, well, a number of years ago now, I happened to be in England on study leave at the same time that the 4th of July celebration was going on here in the States. To my surprise, I discovered that the British also celebrate the 4th of July. I mean, there were signs and flags and lots of revelry in the pubs and all kinds of stuff, and I was so surprised by that I asked someone what was going on. I said, "We celebrate because we got our freedom, we got our independence and broke away from you. Why do you celebrate?" And he said, "Because you left." I guess there are two sides to every story, huh? Well, as I was thinking about freedom, there are all kinds of ways that we can look at and consider freedom. And I've kind of narrowed it down to a couple different things. Freedom from something and freedom to something. If we talk about freedom from something, we can think about freedom from tyranny, or freedom from imprisonment, or freedom from enslavement. But I would guess that most of us haven't experienced on a personal level that kind of thing, or like the kind of thing we're seeing in the video. But we are sometimes enslaved or trapped by ourselves in some ways. Perhaps it's our addictions that have us imprisoned, if you will, and captured. Maybe it's the fact that we have gotten involved in something that's destructive, our relationships or some habits. Maybe we have some compulsive behavior that we can't break free from. Maybe there are some kinds of habits that we have that really hold us tight and won't let us let go of the past and move forward into the present and the future. Whatever they are, we need to break free from them to experience true freedom. But there's the freedom to something, to do something. For example, the freedom to speak our minds. There's the freedom to worship as we want or not. There's the freedom to be who we want to be and to live where we want to live. And that freedom is precious, and it's not something we should ever take for granted. And yet, I'm afraid it is something we do take for granted all too often. Or at least I can say I have all too often. Now, this whole idea of freedom has been on my mind a lot over the last month or so. As I've mentioned to you, Mike and I had the opportunity to go on the Normandy trip with Carver McGriff. Now, if you don't know who Carver is, Carver was the senior pastor over at St. Luke's for 26 years, and I was blessed and fortunate enough to be able to serve alongside him for 10 or 12 of the last years of his tenure there. He was also someone who was a part of the Normandy invasion and a veteran of World War II. He was there when he was 19 years old. And if you were here last year, right before Veterans Day, you may remember that he actually came and we had a chance to interview him on the basis of his book, Making Sense of Normandy, in which he talked about what that experience was like. Well, over the last 4 years, he has led a group of people to Normandy. And there we experience see the beaches and the monuments that are set to commemorate the experiences of that war. We also have seen the places where Carver was in battle, where he was captured, where he was wounded. That's all there. And there are powerful kinds of things to visit. The recent trip, the one that we just took, actually took place right before the 70th anniversary of D-Day that occurred on June the 6th, 1944. And I was really surprised and amazed that 70 years later, all these towns and villages, the French towns and villages, were decorated with French flags, the American flags, and there was an incredible spirit of gratitude for the role that the Americans had played in freeing them from the tyranny of German occupation. And yet, part of what I realized is that there was a huge price that was paid for that freedom. At one point in the trip, we were standing at a location and we're told that 80 U.S. soldiers died in that particular spot on one day. 80 in one spot in one day. And of course, we know the huge toll that occurred as the troops kind of stormed the beaches and tried to come in to fight the Germans. And some 9,000 died on that very first day. It was an incredible price, excuse me, that we paid in order to secure the freedom. And it wasn't just the price that we from the United States paid. The British and the Canadians also were a part of that invasion, and they too suffered, as did the French people. One of the towns we visited was a little town called Perrier. And we had the opportunity to meet with someone that Carver has gotten to know, whose name is Henri. He's a French historian and has studied Carver's unit, Carver's particular division, and how that had impacted the area where he lived. And someone asked how many local residents had died either in the bombings from U.S. or from from German, or how many had been caught in crossfire. And he said that there were 127 citizens of that little town that had died. And you multiply that by every town and village across that part of France, and the numbers are absolutely phenomenal. They are more than we can possibly imagine. Well, on the second day of our trip in Normandy, we went to a museum where there's a video. And it's one of those 360, so this whole thing is surrounding us the entire time. And it tells the story of all the preparations of leaving Britain, of leaving the ships in those little boats that they were going to unload, and they got to the beach. It was a horrible day, terrible waters, very rough. It was cold. It was miserable. Many were seasick. And we saw as the front of those boats went down and the soldiers went out laden with all of their heavy equipment and tried to make their way across the beach in the midst of all the enemy artillery barrage. And we know that many of them didn't quite make that. It was an incredibly moving experience, and I can tell you, after seeing that, so much of the footage, there is no glory in war. It is absolutely horrible. Well, after seeing that video, we walked down what is now a paved path into the town of Arromanches. And some of us were kind of damp from the air and felt like a cup of coffee would warm us up a little bit. And so we went into this little cafe. And when we exited the cafe, someone pointed out to me the picture on the wall across the street. And I thought for a moment it was actually two children painting this picture. But it wasn't. It was a photo or a picture that was actually there. I'll have it on screen there. And the caption really captured my heart. It said, "Please, no more war. Love." Well, that line haunted me in a good way most of the time. And a couple days later, I did the devotion for the group, and I referred to that particular picture. And the Bible passage I used then was a passage that talks about how we are here to love one another. And we only know love because God loved us first. And so we love because we are loved. We love because of God's love. And we're to love one another. Well, the Bible passage I'm using today isn't that same one. This is one from Paul writing to the Galatians, and it's about the freedom to love and to serve one another in love. This is how it reads. "It is absolutely clear that God has called you to a free life. Just make sure that you don't use this freedom as an excuse to do whatever you want to do and destroy your freedom. Rather, use your freedom to serve one another in love. That's how freedom grows. For everything we know about God's word is summed up in a single sentence. Love others as you love yourself." Well, I hope that sounds somewhat familiar, because that's what Jesus says is the greatest commandment, to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And in that love, we are to be responsible in that love and to serve one another in love and to always do what we can to love one another. The thing that was kind of amazing to me is that I saw or heard many acts of love that took place in the midst of the ravages of war. Carver, in fact, I think shared a couple of these of his experiences when he was here last year. For example, a Hispanic soldier who dragged him out of the line of fire after he'd been wounded. Or a German soldier who gave him his canteen to try to quench his thirst after he had been so badly wounded. We stayed in the little town of Bayeux, and there's a huge cathedral, as there is in many of the French towns. And we went in the cathedral one day, and there's a banner hanging in there, and I don't have the words exactly right, but it was something to the effect of, "We are not French, we are not German, we are not American, We are humans. We are all part of the human community. And that really struck me in terms of thinking of seeing one another as human beings. It was really helpful to have realized that when we went to the German cemetery, and to think that these too were human beings. We were trying to free the French from the oppression of a madman, literally, of someone like Hitler, and to make sure that something like that never occurs again in this world. And we paid a huge price to do that kind of thing. But we're talking about this common humanity that we share together. And I began to think about what it would be like if we lived our lives by the code of love. You know, the early Celts had it right, I think. They believed that when you look into the face of another person, you see the face of God. When we look with eyes of love, we'll see love in this world. We'll see love surrounding us in all that we experience. We see love coming toward us from another person. If we looked with eyes of love toward all of those we encounter, I really think it would change the world. And if we were seeing with eyes of love and received love in return, I think, in fact, this hope for peace could become a reality. And then the words of that picture on the wall would ring true. Please, no more war. Love.